Every man wears armor, but not every man knows what he's protecting. It isn't pride, it isn't power. It's the fragile truth beneath the ego, waiting, hoping, to be seen without being shattered. Every man carries within him a constructed identity, a persona he shows to the world. This persona is not inherently false, but it is a selective presentation of his ego, carefully built over time through his experiences, societal expectations, and the desire to be accepted. From early boyhood, he is subtly conditioned to associate his worth with what he can do rather than who he is. Success, control, achievement, and strength become symbols of validation, and so his ego becomes deeply tied to how he is seen, valued, and needed by others. He begins to crave recognition not simply out of vanity, but as a survival mechanism of the psyche. He wants to be somebody in a world that constantly asks him to prove himself. At the heart of this craving lies a silent, unspoken vulnerability. His ego, though armored and often outwardly confident, harbors the fear of being invisible, of not mattering beyond what he can provide or solve. He may never articulate this openly, and in many cases may not even be conscious of it, but within his emotional architecture is the longing to be acknowledged for his essence, not merely for his function. When he is with someone who sees beyond the polished image and touches the raw core of his being, it sends a powerful ripple through his emotional landscape. He may resist it at first, not out of rejection, but because it exposes a depth he is unfamiliar with, a depth that feels both dangerous and liberating. The ego is not evil or selfish. It is a necessary structure in the human psyche. It gives us a sense of self, of purpose, of individual importance. But when the ego is starved of authentic validation, when it is only fed superficial admiration or ignored entirely, it becomes either inflated or defensive. What a man seeks at the deepest level is not to have his ego flattered, but to have it recognized, to have someone reflect back, "I see you, not just what you do, but who you are when the lights are off and no one is watching." This kind of recognition calms the ego. It feels like a homecoming. It bridges the conscious and unconscious mind. It tells the man, you do not have to be everything to be enough. That touch of being seen and not judged, of being valued without needing to impress, has a disarming effect. It dissolves the performative aspect of the persona and allows the true self to emerge. The man who experiences this begins to lower his guard, not because he is weak, but because he feels safe. And when safety meets admiration rooted in truth, the ego is no longer something he hides behind. It becomes a doorway to intimacy, trust, and eventually to love. Within every man lives a silent but powerful archetype, the hero. This inner figure is not merely about courage or physical strength. It is the part of him that seeks meaning through challenge, identity through adversity, and purpose through struggle. The hero's journey is psychological, not just external. From the moment he becomes aware of himself as a separate being, he starts walking the path toward individuation, toward discovering who he really is beneath cultural roles and external achievements. This journey involves conflict, defeat, victories, and setbacks that shape not only his character, but his sense of self-worth. The struggle defines him, even more than the outcome, and it becomes an invisible thread running through his actions, choices, and fears. Most men do not speak of this internal war. They wear a calm or confident face, often suppressing the depth of their existential questions and emotional burdens. Society teaches them to seek success, but not to explore the emotional cost of that pursuit, and so they carry their wounds privately. Underneath their logical minds and composed exteriors, They long to be seen, not as unbreakable machines of responsibility, but as souls carrying the weight of an inner quest. The hero within them wants acknowledgement not just for his victories, but for his endurance. The man who gets up every morning, despite his quiet doubts and invisible failures, craves a witness to the nobility of that persistence. When someone looks at a man and sees more than his outcomes, when they recognize the internal journey he has walked, the pain he hides, the choices he made when no one was watching, it awakens something sacred in him. He feels as though he is not alone in the story he's been telling himself for years. He begins to believe that someone finally sees the truth he could never express. That moment of recognition, when it comes without judgment or pity, touches the very core of his ego. It tells him that he is understood on a mythic level, not just a personal one. It affirms the value of his pain, the worth of his fight, and the purpose of his path. A man's love deepens when someone understands this archetypal struggle, not when they tell him to rest or fix him, but when they acknowledge his spiritual fatigue and honor the journey itself. The recognition does not need to be dramatic. It can be as subtle as a word, a look, a silence that doesn't need to be filled. In that space he finds peace. In that peace, his ego loosens its grip, and in that loosening, the hero finally feels he can stop battling long enough to love. He does not need to conquer to be loved. He only needs to be truly seen. And when he is seen in this way, with reverence for his effort and not just his success, love begins to grow in a way that no external reward ever could. Deep within every man exists a feminine aspect of his psyche, what Carl Jung called the anima. It is not about gender or behavior, but about energy, emotional receptivity, imagination, and connection to the unconscious. The anima is the internal mirror of emotional truth, often projected outward in the form of romantic attraction. What a man unconsciously searches for in another is the reflection of this hidden inner world, a resonance that awakens something familiar but forgotten inside him. His ego, though it may dominate in logic, ambition, or outward action, longs for balance. It yearns to be mirrored by something that brings harmony to his inner duality, to the deep and unseen layers that guide his feelings and instincts. The anima holds the keys to his creativity, intuition, and emotional depth. Yet many men are disconnected from this energy, having been taught to suppress emotion, ignore vulnerability, and favor rationality over introspection. As a result, the ego becomes rigid, defended, and often fragmented. It craves wholeness, but fears the surrender that wholeness requires. When a woman, or any presence aligned with the feminine essence, interacts with him in a way that reflects his anima, he feels strangely drawn, not just physically or mentally, but at a soul level. Something ancient and unnamed stirs within him. He may not understand it consciously, but the experience of being seen and met by that energy feels profoundly familiar, as if she is not just a person, but a key to a hidden part of himself. When this mirror is present, the ego feels safe to soften. It begins to loosen its need to perform and control. The man becomes more curious, more present, more emotionally available. He feels recognized not for what he does, but for what he contains. This reflection allows him to access deeper truths that he may have never acknowledged before. His longing for connection, his creative dreams, his silent hopes, she becomes the gateway through which he meets himself in a new way. Not because she completes him, but because she reminds him of the wholeness that has always been waiting within. This mirroring doesn't occur through words alone. It's in the emotional attunement, in the way she listens, in the subtle energy of acceptance that makes him feel like nothing needs to be hidden. It's the stillness she brings that calms the storm inside his mind. When this happens, his love becomes rooted in something far beyond attraction. It becomes symbolic. It becomes sacred. The connection no longer serves the ego's desire to win or possess. Instead, it satisfies the deeper hunger to be real and integrated. In her presence, he sees not just her beauty, but the reflection of his own buried light. And when a man feels that his internal feminine has been seen and affirmed, he does not merely fall in love with her, he falls in love with life, with meaning, and with the forgotten dimensions of himself she helped him remember. The male ego is not fed through empty compliments or exaggerated praise. It is far more discerning than it may appear on the surface. While it may respond to admiration, it instinctively knows the difference between genuine respect and manipulative flattery. What truly touches a man at his core is admiration rooted in truth, seeing the essence of who he is, without distorting it or turning it into something convenient. The ego longs to be acknowledged in a way that does not inflate it artificially, but instead reinforces its natural sense of worth. This admiration must be delivered with reverence, not submission. It must uplift him without putting him on a pedestal. When a man senses that he is being idealized, that someone is more in love with the image of him than his actual self, his ego may feel powerful for a moment, but will ultimately grow uneasy. Deep down, the masculine self wants to be seen in clarity, not fantasy. He wants to be appreciated, not because someone needs him to be perfect, but because someone understands his imperfections and still finds something deeply honorable in his way of being. When admiration comes from this place, when it acknowledges his discipline, his integrity, his inner strength, or his silent struggles, it creates a resonance in the ego that feels like nourishment rather than inflation. This is why admiration without worship is so crucial. Worship places him above the other person, creating distance. It burdens him with expectations to maintain the illusion, to constantly perform at the level that fantasy demands. In contrast, respectful admiration brings balance. It says, "I see you. I respect your journey. I value your presence." It does not try to control him or fix him. It simply affirms his being. In this space, the ego relaxes. It no longer needs to defend itself, and instead becomes open to intimacy, to vulnerability, and eventually to love. When admiration is expressed with honesty and emotional clarity, it becomes a mirror through which he begins to recognize his own worth in a deeper way. Not the worth that comes from titles, tasks, or trophies, but the quiet worth that lives in his choices, his resilience, and his character. This kind of affirmation does not puff up the ego. It strengthens it. It reminds him that he is enough, not because he is flawless, but because he is real. And when a man feels admired for his truth rather than his performance, he begins to feel safe in that truth. He is no longer trapped by the pressure to impress. Instead, he starts to unfold, to open, to lean into connection with a sincerity that only emerges when the ego is met with both challenge and respect. The bond that forms through this kind of admiration is lasting. It is not dependent on constant praise or validation. It is rooted in mutual recognition, in the silent understanding that love does not come from putting someone above or below, but from standing beside them and seeing who they really are. But a man feels truly seen, not for what he projects, but for who he is beneath the surface. Something powerful happens within his unconscious mind. It creates a lasting imprint, a silent loyalty that is not formed through logic or effort, but through emotional recognition. The ego, always working to protect the man from exposure or inadequacy, begins to trust when it encounters someone who sees beyond the facade and accepts the person within. This kind of connection bypasses surface attraction and enters a deeper, almost mythic realm of bonding. It is as if the soul whispers, "This person knows me in a way others do not," and the man begins to attach, not through dependence, but through resonance. This is why so many men fall in love, not with perfection or charm, but with presence. The presence of someone who understands without needing to fix, who listens without trying to solve, and who remains even when he reveals his flaws. The ego, normally concerned with maintaining strength and composure, lets down its guard in the face of non-judgmental recognition. This vulnerability becomes the birthplace of intimacy. It's not about being understood in every detail, but about feeling that the emotional atmosphere is safe enough to stop performing. When a man can rest in someone's presence without needing to earn approval, his loyalty is no longer a choice. It becomes instinctual. This loyalty is not always conscious. He may not be able to articulate why he feels pulled toward that person, why he returns to her in his mind, why he feels a gravitational pull that defies reason. It's because the ego remembers where it felt at peace, and just like a child returns to the embrace that soothed him, the man returns emotionally to the space where he felt most whole. Even if he continues to chase goals, lead others, or strive for external success, a part of him is anchored in that inner imprint. This is not control or obsession. It is the soul's natural orientation toward truth. The world demands so much from a man. It expects him to be strong, to provide, to withhold emotion, to solve problems, and to keep moving forward, no matter what pain he carries. And so, the man builds a persona that meets those demands. But the need to be known does not disappear. It only hides. When someone acknowledges that hidden self with quiet understanding, the recognition hits deeper than words. It settles into the unconscious. He begins to feel seen, not as a role or a provider, but as a human being who feels, fears, hopes, and struggles. This emotional recognition is what creates lasting emotional bonds. It is not about what she gives him or does for him. It is about how she makes him feel about who he is. When his inner world is reflected back with gentleness and clarity, the ego binds itself emotionally to that experience, and over time, this unconscious loyalty becomes the foundation for love that endures beyond reason or explanation. A man's ego is deeply tied to his sense of autonomy, strength, and purpose. From a young age, he is taught to measure his worth through control over his environment, his emotions, his outcomes. Because of this conditioning, many men become guarded when they sense attempts to mold, correct, or dominate their inner world. The ego, in its effort to preserve selfhood, resists being managed. What it craves instead is empowerment. When a woman interacts with a man in a way that affirms his agency, rather than seeking to reshape him, his ego does not feel threatened. It feels energized. This is not about feeding pride, but about offering space where he can grow into himself without resistance. Empowerment in this context means creating an emotional atmosphere where he feels encouraged to rise, to strive, to be more, not because he is being pressured, but because someone believes in what he already holds within. This belief does not come with conditions or ultimatums. It reflects back his potential in a way that says, "You are already enough, and I see who you can become." That kind of presence inspires the masculine ego to unfold. It allows him to remain sovereign in his identity while feeling safe to evolve emotionally. The key difference between empowerment and control lies in intention. Control tries to direct or correct. It implies that he is not yet acceptable as he is. Empowerment accepts the current version of him while trusting his capacity to grow on his own terms. When a man feels this acceptance, his defenses lower. He no longer feels the need to guard his ego or resist emotional influence. Instead, he becomes more willing to open, to connect, and to invest. The relationship ceases to be a test of dominance and becomes a source of elevation. This dynamic fosters not only emotional trust, but psychological bonding. The empowered ego feels expansive, not defensive. He begins to associate the relationship with inner freedom rather than emotional confinement. In this space, he is not afraid to show weakness or admit uncertainty because he knows that love is not conditional on being perfect. Rather than performing for approval, he becomes real. He allows his heart to be shaped not by fear of judgment, but by inspiration. And that inspiration turns into affection, loyalty, and eventually deep-rooted love. Many men fall in love with a person who helps them believe in themselves again. Not through words alone, but through the energy of encouragement, the quiet support that reminds them of who they are and who they are becoming. This kind of love doesn't inflate the ego, it balances it. It anchors the man in his own strength while opening him to emotional connection. The bond becomes sacred because it honors his individuality, and when he feels that he is not being owned, but understood and uplifted, his heart naturally moves toward the one who offered him that rare gift. That is where real love takes root, where the ego is not eclipsed, but illuminated. The secret to touching a man's ego so he falls madly in love lies not in control, seduction, or performance, but in presence, perception, and emotional wisdom. His ego does not long to be worshipped, it longs to be recognized. When you honor the man behind the mask, when you reflect the hero in his struggle, when you see his soul beyond his strength, something profound awakens in him. You do not conquer his heart by challenging his identity, but by giving it room to unfold. In your reflection, he rediscovers his forgotten wholeness. And when a man feels safe enough to be himself, empowered enough to rise, and deeply seen without needing to impress, his love is no longer a choice. It becomes a devotion born not from the ego alone, but from the soul it tried so long to protect.